I'm Julie Foley. I'm Director of Flood Risk Strategy and National Adaptation at the Environment Agency. I've worked for the Environment Agency for about 16 years in various capacities. In terms of qualifications, I have a degree in geography that I secured from the London School of Economics. And then I went on to do a master's in environmental technology at Imperial College. I've worked in the environmental and sustainability sector for just over about 20 years. I actually started my career working in the wider think tank sector, the charitable sector. I then moved into working as a political advisor for DEFRA at the time, particularly working on issues around water efficiency around the time of the 2006 drought. And then soon afterwards, I moved into the Environment Agency, where I've held a number of different roles and had a really interesting and varied career in the Environment Agency for the last nearly 16 years. I've held national roles, I've been more government and national stakeholder facing, and I've also worked as an area director, leading and managing our teams in a number of areas, including Kent and South London, and before that, Cambridgeshire and Bedfordshire area. I'm really keen to support wider mentoring networks. So I've been part of the Women in FCRM mentoring programme, which I've really enjoyed, being part of a mentoring circle group. What I found really interesting and brilliant about it is actually having a two-way conversation, being able to share some advice and some tips from my own perspective, from my own career, but actually listening and learning from the experience of others who are developing their careers as well. So that's been a really great opportunity. I'm also a really strong advocate for equality, diversity and inclusion. So in the Environment Agency, I'm one of our race executive champions. And I'm the race lead in the Environment Agency, working with our staff network on BAME issues. And that's something I'm just really, really passionate about, actually. I think as I've developed my career, particularly in flood and coastal risk management, it is traditionally quite a male-dominated career. That's something that thankfully is changing. We've got more women in more senior roles now, which is brilliant. But it's also an area that needs to be much more diverse, particularly in terms of representing the communities in which we serve. You know, absolutely everybody is impacted by flooding and environmental damage. And so it's really important that we reflect the communities and the views and voices of the communities in which we work with. So I think being a more diverse and inclusive organisation in terms of how we work and how we do business is really, really vitally important. I've done a whole variety of different things actually over the course of my career. I started off working for think tanks, working in national policy. And when I joined the Environment Agency, I was doing a role that involved, again, particularly working with government on a whole host of issues. So I worked on what was then the National Planning Policy Framework, and at the time, growth proposals around eco-towns and growth points. And I found myself really loving that work, actually, because I have always loved actually influencing government policy and it being the heart of doing that. But I did also find that I wasn't really developing myself or stretching myself. And so I very intentionally changed career in the Environment Agency. I sort of did a reinventing myself, if you like, where I moved into roles in operations. And I remember initially I found that quite scary, actually, because it really was pushing myself out of my comfort zone. I knew so well how to be involved in national policy debates, how to influence that, how to work with national stakeholders. But in operations in our local areas, I'd never been involved in local instant response, in actual responding to a major flood event, a major waste fire, a fish pollution incident. Those are really key things in operations. And I had to give myself a bit of a nudge and a push to be brave, to apply for a different job in the Environment Agency as an area director. And the first area director job I did was actually on assignment as a job swap, which was as the area director for Anglian Central, as it was called at the time, which covered Cambridgeshire and Bedfordshire and parts of North Norfolk. And it was a massive learning curve. I remember going to that job day one, week one, and literally not knowing what to do and feeling quite anxious about the things, about this being really outside of my comfort zone, my expert areas. But several years later, I had absolutely no regrets about it. I really loved actually understanding the local insight of how national policy is translated into experience on the ground. What would I have liked to have known at the beginning of my career? I think probably thinking carefully about those first few jobs. I just reflecting when I left, I did a MSc in environmental technology at Imperial College, and it was a brilliant course. And I made many friends on that course as well, who I'm still in touch with today. And when we were completing the course, we were all applying for jobs, in some cases the same jobs, largely for a lot of environmental consultancies. And I remember being on the interview treadmill, going for quite a few interviews, and fortunately I got offered quite a few jobs. And then there came along an experience to work for business in the community, looking at social enterprises and their contribution to sustainability more generally. But the role was not as well paid as some of the environmental consultancy roles. And I had a real dilemma because I actually thought that role was more interesting. And in the end, I went for the business in the community role. And I think that was probably one of the most significant decisions I could have made, actually leaving university, because it wasn't the highest paid role. It didn't, on the face of it, look like the job that had the most immediate career prospects. But by working in business in the community, I got to work with some amazingly experienced people, some key opinion formers, some real shapers and influencers. And at that stage in my career, I learned so much from them. And that might have just been luck, really, on reflection now. But if anybody was asking me for advice now, I would say to them, seek out people that you admire, you respect, and who importantly you want to learn from. And go for those jobs initially when you leave university or higher education, because you will learn so much from learning from others who are really inspirational. And it was as a consequence of that experience I had at business in the community that I went on to secure another job for a leading think tank called the Institute for Public Policy Research, where I went on to do a lot of key research and learnt from many others. And it opened up many doors subsequently as well. But it all initiated from making that first decision to take a role in the third sector and to go for something that, as I said, on the face of it, wasn't necessarily looking like the most economically beneficial career choice. I think probably two things I would say has helped me to get to where I am today. I think it's seeking out some really good mentors. As I was saying, it's really important to find people that you admire and respect, and to ask them for careers advice, and to ask them to coach you. What I've always found is whenever I've reached out to other people who I view as more senior than me, more experienced, and say, well, would you provide me with some coaching advice or some mentoring? Very rarely do they say no. I find a lot of people are actually genuinely quite generous with their time, and give you some great advice because they've kind of been there and done that, and can give you, therefore, all of their experiences. So I've had some brilliant mentors over my career, and they've gone on to help me establish my networks, my profile, and helped open doors and opportunities for me as well. So that's been key. I think a second thing I would flag is hard work and perseverance. For a lot of us who work in the environmental sector, and I now work on flood adaptation and climate resilience, these are areas of work that require, quite a hard slog. They are often, climate adaptation is often the poor relation to debates on climate mitigation. You have to work very hard. You have to be really determined. And so I would say a key part of anyone's career development is is not just talent, but actually being prepared to work really hard and to have that perseverance to keep pushing great ideas. I'm not sure I could point to something specific, actually, in terms of a career flop or failure. I think I would probably say that working on climate adaptation means that you do need to continue to really try and raise the profile of the importance of adaptation alongside climate mitigation. There's so many myths and misconceptions. Sometimes there's views that you do climate mitigation instead of adaptation. That's a great misconception. We know that things like nature-based solutions and natural flood management help us not only adapt to a changing climate and mitigate the impacts of flooding, but they can be great ways of sequestering carbon. And so there are many, many win-wins. I think that's an argument that we're still, as a sector, working really hard to embed that understanding, particularly amongst policymakers and politicians locally and nationally. So I would still say I'm working at that, but I understand that it's going to take some time, actually. But I've never seen so much more focus than we have now, actually, on the climate emergency. So I'm also pretty optimistic, actually, about how we can continue to get those key arguments across about the urgency for adaptation. But without doubt, it tends to be the poor relation on climate change debates, and we need to change that going forward. This valuable lesson I've learned during my career is perhaps I would use 2 Ps: the importance of patience and perseverance. Patience and perseverance, and I say that because I think my experience is that it takes time often for really good ideas to take flight. I think when I started out in my career, I had this somewhat perhaps naive, view that if you had a really good idea and you could make a great case for it and you evidenced it, surely everybody would get that it was a great idea and it would just happen. It was logical. What I've subsequently learned is there are small other matters like politics, like having champions for your ideas, like lobby groups who would lobby against your ideas, perhaps for other vested interests. And the reality is, sometimes it takes time for a really good idea to really come off. And you probably have to be prepared to go back around the loop of that idea, maybe at several different intervals in your career. I give an example of this that I think really taught me this lesson really early on. I mentioned one of my early jobs was working for the Institute for Public Policy Research, and I was a pretty junior researcher at the time. And I was fortunate enough to work with some brilliant academics. And one of those was Stephen Glaister, who's at Imperial College. He still is. And he's very eminent in his field on looking at road and rail pricing and other related matters, particularly in the field of the transport sector. And we were doing some work with him looking at road pricing. And at the time, you could make a really good case for road pricing, a clear economic case. You're going to get so much more growth, so many more people, so many more cars on the road. We've got to tackle climate change. Road pricing, surely it's a no-brainer. Well, I suppose it is on paper, but the politics of road pricing is not very easy. People don't always want to pay for their road usage. It's not necessarily a political vote winner. And he'd been working on that for many years, making that case. And then we had a quite transformational moment. That moment came with the then Mayor of London, who was Ken Livingstone at the time, introducing the London congestion charge. And it changed some of the debate to the one that I think we're still having today, even on road pricing and how we approach that. But it really raised the visibility of that concept. And that was a real lesson learned for me in political timing, right ideas, the right moment. And when you get to that moment, grabbing those opportunities. because the debate changed hugely with introducing the under congestion charge. But it also showed that more transformational ideas, which is often the case what we need for the environmental sector, we don't just need little ideas, we need often transformational ideas that change whole ways of working, ways in which sectors are doing business. Those require some bravery and leadership, and in many cases, some really strong political leaders. So I think that probably has been one of the key lessons learned for me, actually, in how I have sought to get buy-in to some of the more transformational work that I've been involved in. How has my approach to challenges changed throughout my career? I think I would use the work that I'm currently involved in. So I'm currently Director of Flood Risk Strategy in the Environment Agency, and a big part of this role has been developing and creating the National Flood and Coastal Erosion Risk Management Strategy, and then subsequently going on to develop a roadmap about how we're actually going to deliver that strategy, something that we're launching at Flood and Coast. And a really key part of my learning around that is the importance of having a coalition of partners. I say that because when we developed the strategy, it had some really game-changing concepts in it. We talked about putting climate adaptation at the heart of all of our work on flood and coastal risk management. We talk about a new approach, moving away from traditional flood defences to looking at resilience, so nature-based solutions, property flood resilience, sustainable drainage systems, things that are great ideas that are out there but not yet mainstreamed, and require some real changes in approaches about how we design and develop projects and work with communities on those projects. The strategy talks about coastal adaptation and some of the real challenges for communities that are facing threats of coastal erosion. These are really, really difficult and challenging concepts. We wouldn't have been able to put forward the ideas that we had in the strategy just as the Environment Agency. So yes, the Environment Agency absolutely is a key player, and we've got some key responsibilities. But without the support of local authorities, farmers, internal drainage boards, environmental groups, the financial insurance sector, then it wouldn't be possible to have had the buy-in to the strategy to make it a successful document that actually was something that we could actually go on and implement. So a big part of my learning in terms of approaching sort of challenging pieces of work is the importance of building relationships, building a coalition of partners, because that yields massive dividend. And I'm really seeing that today, because we're now actively thinking about how we implement the strategy. It's kind of all very well to have some really brave, bold words in a strategy document, but unless you implement it, it's not going to actually make a difference to people and communities on the ground. And that's the most important thing, clearly. But because we've built those relationships and those partnerships, and we've brought people along with us, they're now coming on board and are a part of our delivery and are owning the strategy themselves. So I think one of my big tips, I suppose, to taking on challenging projects or concepts or transformational areas of work that involve business change is to really ensure that you build the networks and relationships and partnerships to come with you on that journey. I'd probably, in terms of tips for early career professionals, I think the top one I would pull out is it's to seek mentors and to seek advice. I've learned so much from working with other people. I still am. Whatever stage of your career you're at, actually, you should continue to learn and learn from others. But earlier on in my career, it was really, really useful to be able to understand people who were several years ahead of me, in some cases many years ahead of me, and to understand their career journey, and for them to share a bit about what did or didn't work, particularly as a woman in the sustainability sector and in the flood and coastal risk management sector now, which is quite male dominated. there wasn't always that many women to look up to as well. And that, that can sometimes present barriers and obstacles in your career that you have to confront as a young woman starting out in this profession. But reaching out to others that could help me and give me advice and counsel was just brilliant, actually. So I think that would be the biggest tip I would give people, actually, is reach out to mentors and coaches and people you admire in order to give you the careers advice you need. I think in terms of thinking about career development suggestions, a major point for me is to continue to learn and to look for opportunities to join courses. When I was an area director, I joined a course on professional leadership in project and program delivery. It wasn't an area that I'd actually had any professional training in, but I found myself as an area director in the Environment Agency really managing large projects and programs, and I've subsequently gone on to do that even more. And actually I thought it'd be really useful to actually do a professional qualification in it rather than learn on the job, which I would imagine most people probably think would be good enough. That's true, but actually doing a professional qualification and learning from others and having a coaching group of people who are in the profession of project and program management was really, really helpful. So that's something I would encourage. I'm also a really strong believer in supporting development of technical skills. When I started off in the Environment Agency, I was particularly leading our work on spatial planning. It's an area that I absolutely love. In terms of town and country planning, we've got specialists in the Environment Agency who are involved in advising local planning authorities on flood risk and development applications. That requires investment in professions and skills. And I think that can be really underrated, but it's absolutely vital to continue to develop some of those professionalisms. And in the flood and coastal sector, there are so many. We've got hydrologists, we've got engineers, as I mentioned, we've got spatial planners. I would also say community and comms and engagement is also another professional area as well, which is really, really important. I think all of those professionalisms are just very, very important to invest in whatever role that you have. I would certainly encourage that.